Hello and welcome to CommieCast. I'm Stuart McGill. Thanks for joining us on this episode. Now, if you can control the narrative of the past, you control the present. If I can just get a wee plug in here very early. I've just finished a book for Manifesto Press, The Top 10 Economic Myths, and it's striking just how often the right wing use wholly false narratives, particularly about the 1970s, to shape standard economic views and reactions today. Real wages grew by an average of 2.9% per annum in the 70s, quite unlike the situation of declining real wages today. So when Tories shout the usual feeble mantra, those policies will take us back to the 1970s, we should say, hell yeah, let's do that. Now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, a new political phenomenon has emerged and become a major, some would say a directing force of the new right across Europe. This is historical revisionism, a specific term that refers to a combination of anti-communism, hostility to public service-led economies, disregard for certain elements of capitalist democracy, anti-Semitism, and a strong dose of militarism, usually aimed at Russia and China. Today we're going to talk to two activists who campaigned on this theme, writing, speaking, and trying to alert working people to the danger represented by historical revisionism. Now, guys, I'm going to turn to you both for a quick couple of introductions. Phil Katz, who are you and why are you qualified to talk about this?
Hi, I'm Phil Katz. I'm a designer by profession and a writer. I've written a book, Freedom from Tyranny, Against the Falsification of History, and extensively on historical revisionism, Holocaust denial, and fake news. And I've spoken about my work across Britain, in Moscow, Madrid, and in Italy. I'm happy to join you this evening, though I would have preferred to have picked a jollier subject.
Well, maybe at some point we can pick a jolly subject, but that would go against the whole principles of CommieCast so far. Okay, Dan, tell us about yourself, please, mate. Dan Ross.
Thanks, Stuart. Evening, Phil. Yeah, my name is Dan Ross. I'm a Communist Party member and sometime electoral candidate based in Manchester. I've written some articles looking at, in particular, anti-communist mythology that has grown up around the alleged Xinjiang Uyghur genocide and the events of the so-called Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, and how specifically how these narratives are used to serve very specific political agenda here in the West.
Okay, mate, that sounds interesting. All this stuff will be useful to have in some way through a link, ideally, that we can put on the website which accompanies this podcast. So furnish me with that later and I'll stick it on the website. Okay, let's get into the nitty gritty now. Phil Katz, define historical revisionism for us and tell us who you think is behind it as a phenomenon.
Thanks, Stu. Revising history is not necessarily a bad thing and isn't necessarily a new thing. There's a completely new school of thought on Richard III, for example. But lies dressed up as history is a bad thing. History is and will always be contested, and that depends in part on the levels of class struggle and class consciousness. If the capitalists are stronger, a little bit like you said in your opening, then their version of history is going to dominate, and vice versa. Unusually amongst writers, I combine historical revisionism with Holocaust denial and fake news because the new right-wing ideology hops across all three. Historical revisionism isn't a specific moment or a contested event. It's not about we suffered more casualties than you dropped more bombs, you allied with them, but you didn't ally with the others. You won't get people to drop their allegiance to a version of history by shouting louder or protesting more strongly. It's part of ideology, and ideology is all-embracing and has to be painstakingly challenged and picked apart across a broad range of fronts. In its modern meaning, historical revisionism is about revising the outcome of the defeat of fascism in 1945 in order to justify a new set of politics, a kind of new platform, if you like. It's a pan-national movement. which now has a base in every country and every locality. It's built in many instances on the flimsiest of facts and on outright fabrication, but it has legs because it kind of serves a function, or it rationalizes an ideology, which is the offensive strategy of the right wing across Europe. It also now forms the basis of government aims and policies in a large number of countries, probably the majority of those grouped in the EU. Historical revisionism is allied to opposition to socialist economies. And also, I think it's a sort of opposition to a notion of communism, a spectre of communism. Where it's got the upper hand in Slovakia and Hungary, Poland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine, it has led to suppression of the left, control of the press, ending of the right to free speech, constraining the rights to association and assembly, and in particular restricting labour rights. But it also involves making aggressive demands, territorial demands on neighbours, at the same time as trying to shut their borders to large population movements coming in. It's also about militarising the state and putting it on a constant war footing whilst privatising all public functions. So these are some of the rationales behind historical revisionism, and they are big topics. I'd like to emphasise that it's been restricted to a kind of Eurocentric debate, but it certainly isn't that. In China, Taiwan is a legacy issue of 1945, as are relations between China, South Korea, and Japan. In India, it's an issue. In America now, and certainly in Canada, it's a big issue. And also across what was once Soviet Asia. So it's now become part of that right-wing drive that has captured the EU and NATO. And as such, the front for and against historical revisionism is very broad. But those in favour of it have way more power and resources, especially now that America is behind them.
All right, Phil, thanks for that. And why is 1945 the baseline for this new historical revisionism?
I think that's a very interesting question, because in a way it's a baseline for those who are in favour of historical revisionism and those who oppose it. At the Nuremberg trials, the Executive Trial Council, I think it was American, Robert Story, said that the aim of the trial was the making of a record of the Hitler regime which would withstand the test of history. But in a way, Nuremberg focused on crimes against peace and war crimes, not crimes against humanity. So there's only been a kind of partial understanding of what actually happened in the run-up to 1945, and only a partial judgment since then. And it wasn't until Eichmann was put on trial in Jerusalem in 1961 and Klaus Barbie was put on trial in France in 1984 that the entirety of the war and what went on actually emerged. So I would say that 45 is really important, because you get the Nuremberg trials, you get the guilty verdicts, you get the start of the discussions that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you get the Genocide Act of 1947, and many of the institutions that came out of the 1945 victory are those that are now being pressurized and subverted.
So it's not a case of the post-war consensus, so-called, being gradually whittled away in the interests of the right wing. Okay, interesting stuff. Dan, you've been listening very patiently to all that. Sorry to keep you there, mate. What's your view on this? And also, please tell us in broad terms why you think all this matters and why historical revisionism has been so successful in forming or deforming mainstream narratives.
Well, it does matter. There is a broad anti-communist consensus in the Anglosphere, if you like, in Britain, North America, and Australia, which is grounded not least in the fact that these countries are essentially the victor nations of the Second World War. Perhaps just as importantly, these are countries that were not actually subjected to Nazi occupation, with courtesy mentioned to the Channel Islands, of course, but by and large, these countries were not subjected to Nazi occupation and were victors in the Second World War. Therefore, you might argue that they were more freely able to define the terms of the post-war discourse. It's important. These countries were and are at the spearhead of the capitalist bloc during the Cold War period. Certainly, one can see a difference in societies like Spain or Greece or France, where the communist parties are far more accepted in the proverbial mainstream. I think not least because their contributions to those countries' resistance to fascism was significant and is still really within living memory. We saw the narrative then emerge of Soviet society being essentially one of an open prison, the characterization of the Gulag system as being implicitly on a par with concentration camps, for instance, something the post-Soviet archives themselves really repudiate. There's in the popular imagination, of course, is filled with imagery taken from George Orwell or Solzhenitsyn of KGB agents on every street corner, children informing on the parents, that type of thing. These characterizations are enormously important to the Western ruling class in order to avoid or even prevent ordinary citizens like ourselves, ordinary working people in our own societies from focusing too much, if at all, on the great achievements of socialism in Eastern Europe, transforming erstwhile feudal, superstitious, illiterate backwater societies, czarist societies, into scientific and technological powerhouses within a generation, whilst also dramatically self-improving the standard of living of its own people. I mentioned at the beginning that I've written a little on China now, where we've seen a similar tendency in focusing on exaggerated or fabricated narratives to blind people from the fact that Chinese socialism itself has, like the USSR, transformed the lives of hundreds of millions of people, and the country itself from one of the poorest in the world to an enormous and confident superpower. So yeah, this really matters because at the moment, our societies, battered as they are by an increasingly acute and deliberately confected cost of living crisis, we may begin to wonder ourselves about China and the USSR's achievements. And it would not be long before we begin joining the dots and demanding the same thing. And if that happens, it really is game over for our own working class. So it's important, and it does matter.
Very nice answer. Thanks very much indeed. It's interesting. There is a real effort to discredit what happened before, which doesn't fit in with the narrative now, which is why they talk trash about the 1970s, which was actually a very successful economic decade. Actually, growth in the 70s, despite the problems, was greater than it was in the 1980s. So it does beg the question of what Thatcher saved us. What Thatcher did save us from. Also, we need to do a podcast about Orwell at some time because people talk about Homage to Catalonia in particular as if it's a history book. It's not. It's basically a full of lies piece of propaganda. Anyway, another podcast at another time. Phil, back to you. Why does the whole thing seem to matter more in continental Europe than in Britain? And why should British people worry about this?
Well, I think you're right to ask why, because the situation in Britain is different, and that shapes both the international policy of the Labour movement and of the government. So to be accurate, it is an issue for all countries. It's a leading and live issue in the Baltics, in Central, Eastern, and parts of Southern Europe and of Russia. Historical revisionism is heavily contested in France, in Italy, in Spain, and in Greece. And only in Germany and in Britain does the historical record come close to the decisions and the definitions laid down during the Nuremberg trials. Basically, that fascism was an aggressive and genocidal movement and that its destruction was a good thing. In Britain, it's different because we emerged as a victor nation. And as Dan's just said, we only experienced occupation in the Channel Islands. But the way that we see World War II is a very divided one. The ruling class seek to co-opt historical revisionism to fit their relations, current day relations with NATO and their aggressive aims against Russia. In Britain's schools and on the BBC, which is both influential as and an arena of intense struggle of ideas, we still refer to the People's War, which was won through a system of alliances in which the USSR took the brunt of the fighting. Most serious historical narrators in this country start with that premise, and most government ministers ignore it. But it was something that Willie Gallagher and Harry Pollitt and Churchill agreed on. It was Churchill that said it was the Red Army that tore the guts out of the Nazi war machine. I said earlier that ideology was difficult to unpick, and nowhere more so than on historical revisionism and the anti-Semitism that led to the genocide of the Jews and the Roma people. Across other countries, the Holocaust is revised, denied, relativized. Some try to compare Soviet post-war occupation with the Holocaust of the Nazis, but in Britain, it's more broadly accepted and understood than ever. So our kind of, what I would say is, historical revisionism can be, you can teach as much as you like in the schools. The historical memory is, and popular memory, and the ideas and the stories passed on through generations are very powerful. And in Britain, fascism was defeated by 1937. Only in the USSR was fascism defeated before 1939. So the idea in our mind of Cable Street, Madrid, El Alamein, D-Day, Berlin, that there's a continuity there that is very difficult for revisionists to unpick. And there's a popular memory, but also a sense of pride in that war generation. In Britain, you've got wonderful campaigning work on behalf of historical memory, but the numbers left alive are relatively few. And in their absence, in the absence of their live testimony, the internet has taken over, and fake news comes in where people can describe events, but in a way that has no reference point or accountability. But that is how so many young people receive their news and their history.
It's interesting. I hear what you say then, because I think one of the reasons why we never really had a particularly strong fascist movement here, despite the success of the British movement, the British National Party and the National Front, for a certain short amount of time, is the historical memory. And the way Britain depicts itself as the country which stood against fascism, stood against the Nazis. Now, certainly my father's generation had that, even quite right-wing people who were big fans of what Enoch Powell said, would never have voted for an overtly fascist party. That does seem to be slightly different compared to other European countries. Dan, what's your take on this as a younger person?
Well, I think it's worth returning to some underpinning principles when considering this question. We often frame 20th century discourse as having been dominated by three monoliths: the nominal totalitarian twins of fascism on the right and communism on the left, and the capitalist democracies which ultimately prevailed in this great ideological battle. As historical and dialectical materialists, we understand that the flow of history is a little more nuanced than that. Fascism, of course, grew out of and was facilitated by capitalism during periods of acute political and economic crisis. Communism, by contrast, grew from coordinated and organized working class movements and posed a significant threat to the capitalist order itself, including capitalism's propensity to slide into fascism. The framework, it's important not just in understanding history, but comprehending what we're actually seeing today. The actual legitimization of fascistic language symbolism and state organization, not just in Ukraine, by the way, but dare I say here in Britain, across the European Union and the NATO alliance. So historical revisionism essentially is establishing a narrative of Soviet criminality as a precursor, even as an excuse for Nazi criminality. And it is a really important part of establishing that dynamic.
Yeah, it's very important for people to recognize that there were certainly issues with what the Soviet Union did and also some of the Eastern Bloc countries. They weren't by no means saints. However, fascism was basically an ethnic violent cult, all right, which looked to actually victimize certain people, and particularly in the case of Nazism, destroy a certain group of people. The Soviet Union had its issues, but it never fell into that. It's very important to maintain that distinction, I think. Okay, thanks for that, Dan. Phil, how do you think the rise of historical revisionism has influenced the course of politics in Europe in recent years? Is there a link between the success of the fascists in Italy, because fascists they are, and we shouldn't shy away from calling them that, and historical revisionism? The war in Ukraine, has that been influenced by the course of historical revisionism? Now, if so, please explain, for people like me, the details, the nuts and bolts of those links, and where appropriate, how Holocaust denial takes part in that process.
Okay. Interestingly, on what you just said, the great Nazi hunter, the leader of the Wiesenthal project, Ephraim Zurov, said that it's impossible to equate those who built Auschwitz with those who liberated it. So if ever in your mind you feel that there's a blurring of roles, I think that is a very clear way.
So let me just interject there a second, because it's interesting, this point. I was chatting to a student a little while ago who regards herself as being somebody who understands politics. And she said to me, oh, the hard right and the hard left are just the same. And also somebody I did a podcast with about the book, he said to me, the hard right and the hard left, they meet somewhere around the back. And I said to them both, I am what some people would call hard left, and I am nothing like people on the hard right. I've been fighting them, sometimes physically, for a large part of my life. So I think it's important that we go ahead and disabuse people of that ridiculous notion. Sorry, sir, carry on.
That's all right. I think the answer to your questions about has the rise of historical revisionism influenced the course of politics in Europe, and is there a link with Italy and the war in the Ukraine? The answer is yes, yes, and yes. And I think we have to look at it. There are three elements to this. The first is the demise of socialism as a countervailing force. So in the socialist countries like the GDR or the Soviet Union, glorifying fascism was illegal. Membership of political parties that were fascist was illegal. But after 1989, it no longer was illegal, and the rats, if you like, came out of the sewers. Many of them had been part of the so-called democracy movement, who were just basically anti-Russian and anti-Semitic. But from the second point is that these ideas always crystallize themselves in movements and in organizations. And I think there emerged, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the most successful right-wing movement since 1945, called the Prague Declaration Movement. And I'll call them the PDM, but they gradually gained support in the EU Parliament and latched onto the fact that an awful lot of money and power and influence came from within the EU. And so, although they'd originally made their names as, like, say, Le Pen or Partido Popular, Vox in Spain, Meloni in Italy, the Fratelli, the Northern League, although they'd made their name opposing the EU, once they got elected to the parliament, they very quickly changed that and started to use the funding, the ability to set up so-called museums of memory, influence the schools' curricula, trying to undo Holocaust Memorial Day and substitute it with a day on, that marked the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of Non-Aggression. So that group now, they started out relatively as a hodgepodge of opponents of socialism, is now poised to become the dominant force, admittedly through alliance, but in the EU Parliament. And they talk about, interestingly enough, my third point is exactly what the woman said on your course. How do they rationalize their existence? They didn't just draw on traditional anti-communism. It's more sophisticated than that. It draws on American sociology, on 1970s German revisionist politics and history. And they basically say that communism and fascism were the same. They call it the red-brown equivalence, that the USSR had used genocide like Hitler, so they refer to a double genocide. And they say that the Holocaust, no one denies the Holocaust anymore, but of course it's just one of many Holocausts, and why make such a fuss about it? In fact, there's now a historical inversion, a Holocaust inversion movement, which says that the Holocaust conducted by the Soviet Union in countries like Lithuania was worse than the Holocaust that we all know was true. So I think we had a shock in Britain when in August 2019, the Prague Declaration movement forces tabled a motion on historical revisionism in the EU Parliament, and Britain's Labour MEPs voted for it. I think that was a real shameful betrayal, but it was also a wake-up call that there was a danger of historical revisionism getting a foothold in this country. I think in the Ukraine war, you're dealing with people who really, really suffered during World War II. Hence the sensitivity of the use of the phrase denazification at the start of the conflict, and the failed attempts to drag in Belarus, for example, which lost over 80% of its Jews and a third of all its adults in just 24 months. And it also explains the role of the Polish government with its pathological it's a Russophobia, effectively. So all these things are in the mix, but they're organized through the Prague Declaration movement. And the second largest grouping of EU MEPs now is constituted on the basis of the Prague Declaration movement. And it's a bit trite to say, not a lot of people in Britain know that. I think not a lot of people on the left know that. And a lot of people on the left are looking for these SS black uniform jackboots to come marching up the street so they can have a scrap with them on the street corner, without realizing that across Europe, there are now open fascists on the NATO Council, open fascists that are EU commissioners, and they are determining and designing the drive to war. And that's what's going on out there.
We're recording this during the Helsinki conference, but during the Vilnius conference on should Ukraine join NATO, and the Americans have been significantly more cautious than some of the East European states, whose Russophobia is toxic, and they are very keen to get Ukraine into NATO, which is a very dangerous thing in many ways. Right, Phil, thanks for that. Dan, over to you. One of the key elements of empire building and attempts to legitimize empire is dehumanization. The British and other European empires reduced Africans to something less than human to justify slavery. Settler colonists, past and present, dehumanize and belittle in order to legitimate. Is there an element of this in historical revisionism? And does this manifest itself in some of the language and attitudes towards Russians that you see reported on our media without any censure? Russians are depicted as inherently savage imperialists and orcs, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, you said it yourself, Stuart. We see this manifestation today in the war in Ukraine. Now, leaving aside the right or the wrong of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022, and by the way, it is worth reiterating that we communists have repeatedly and uniformly called for an end to the war as a matter of urgency, something that is conspicuously missing from Western governments, NATO, the EU, and their cheerleaders in the press. But leaving that to one side for a moment, the Russian people themselves are very much othered through the use of such language as orcs, which you will come across often on social media and through these loose networks of the likes of NAFO, a deeply unserious but seemingly very popular online trend at the moment. The Russian media has in itself been effectively censored over here. I mean, I recall The Guardian supporting a call from Ukraine's culture minister to boycott Tchaikovsky of all things. This is testament to that phenomenon. After all, it is far easier to other and to dehumanize people if we cannot hear, read, or see them. From a Russian perspective, it's certainly not unreasonable to note that the eastern expansion of a defensive military alliance, so-called, has followed an almost identical trajectory to that of the last invasion from the West. And perhaps we can afford some consideration to the fact that Russian people themselves may feel alarmed by that. And it's almost laughable to imagine that NATO is doing this with their best interests in mind.
Oh yeah, if anybody thinks that America and NATO is involved in Ukraine because they love the Ukrainian people, they can pop round to my place. I've got some magic beans I'd like to sell them. Dan, you've written a bit about what's happening in China now with the Uyghurs, and the Chinese are accused of genocide here. Is this fitting in with the paradigm that Phil talked about before? The accusations of communism being as bad as Nazism and fascism?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Again, Stuart, as I said at the beginning, this is part of a dynamic to essentially vilify communism itself, and not just for the sake of it, for essentially ideological purposes. Communism is an inherent and existential challenge to capitalism and to the West, and ultimately, what the West is trying to achieve here is penetration into currently unpenetrable markets, whether it is in Russia or whether it's in China. And historically, like I say, the effort that was made to sort of overcome the USSR through the 1980s, and the same thing happened with the Balkans. This was all designed to penetrate those impenetrable markets. So there is rationality behind this, but yes, certainly the concept behind the idea of communism being inherently genocidal plays into that whole narrative, and it's a distraction to draw people's attention away from the actual achievements of communism and socialism.
Okay, mate, thank you for that. Phil, any thoughts about any of that?
If I can add to what Dan said, just a minor reflection. The Prague Declaration movement that I've been describing has, unsurprisingly, a declaration which has gone through a whole number of iterations over the last 20 years. But people miss that the first one included condemnation of Mao's China as the greatest perpetrator of mass genocide, not Hitler, Mao, and called for support for the Dalai Lama, which even I think Thatcher probably thought was so bizarre and left field compared to the mainstream. But it does show exactly what Dan's been saying, that the idea was to oppose communism in all its manifestations. The thing about the Prague Declaration movement is it started out opposing communism, but the problem is now that it's eating up its own democratic institutions.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, Dan, we've been talking outside the podcast world about the actual history of East Germany, or the DDR, as we should more appropriately call it. And this is a classic case of delegitimization, I guess. Fill us in on some of the highlights of that important dialectic, to use a Marxist term there.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, there is a common misconception about the DDR here in Britain and elsewhere in the West. These are well established and prevalent. It's worth touching on an often ignored element in that discourse, and that is the actual nostalgia for the period. The fact that this nostalgia is in fact grounded in the actual memory of that time, when basic yet fundamental needs from education to housing, employment to healthcare were all catered for. This should not come really as a surprise, given the comparative struggle that former DDR regions in East Germany have experienced in these particular fields since the reunification of Germany itself. Very hardships that we here in Britain are ourselves very familiar with, and increasingly so. I mean, of course, as you said, Stuart, socialist societies, including the DDR, were incapable of sustaining themselves in the end. Not through bloodshed and violence, of course, but through a sort of general malaise. And there are lessons to be learned here for socialists and communists, which we will, of course, discuss in due course. But what is certainly apparent is how easy it is to rue the things that were taken for granted before and how difficult it is to win them back after.
A very good point. Yeah, the book is actually called Stasi State or Socialist Paradise, a very interesting and pretty well balanced book. I'll stick it up on the website that accompanies the podcast. There's a very interesting quote at the end of the book from a car mechanic, Michael, a committed Catholic and certainly no simplistic apologist for the DDR. He says, "What I particularly miss today is the comradeship and friendships I had in DDR times. I find it difficult to adapt to this elbow society," as indeed do many of us in the elbow society, which has basically been developing here since 1979. Phil, you spent some time in the DDR. What's your view? And also, what I want you to do here, tell us how this distorted history of DDR and indeed the rest of the Eastern Bloc that we're fed, how does that relate to the overarching narratives of historical revisionism?
Well, I would say that I had some very interesting experiences in the GDR, one of which was that I was asked to lecture at Humboldt University about capitalism, and I just described an average person's life. And at the end, the teachers said, "Wow, that was fantastic. The feedback that from the students, they really believed what you were saying, but they wouldn't have believed their teachers," which I think is a concern. And I was 3 times in the GDR, and on the 3rd time, I led a big delegation of young trade unionists, which kind of gave us access to ordinary people and glimpses into their lives, and also for them to glimpse into our lives during the exchanges that took place. We visited the Leica factory, which had 12,000 engineers and skilled workers. It was a huge place. We met the party committees, we met the administrators, some of whom, by the way, had been stationed in England during the war. And of course, we had a very, very frank exchange about how much our housing cost, how we got access to education. They had an amazing health service, which was recognized during its time by the United Nations. I think that the division of Germany always guaranteed that there'd be a kind of different approach to the period of the 1920s to 1945. In the GDR, fascism was outlawed. In the West, many senior judges, police officers, heads of Interpol, government officials had been enthusiastic servants of fascism. They'd simply changed their kit and their club. In fact, in the 50s and 60s, 5,000 out of 12,500 serving judges had served under the Hitler regime. In the West, initially, citizens were encouraged to forget, and many had good reason not to question. In the GDR, they weren't allowed to forget, even if they wanted to. And every student had to visit, for example, Sachsenhausen concentration camp as part of their curriculum. But of course, reunification changed that. And I think a lot of people just assume that the West hoovered up the East, but I don't believe that's true. And I think on historical revisionism, the position of Eastern Germany to honestly and genuinely look into its history and how did fascism come about was later reflected in scholarship in universities and in policies of the government, which didn't allow its army to grow beyond a certain size, didn't allow them to serve abroad. That with the decline of that generation that experienced the GDR and then West Germany, you've now got changes, and you've got the German Air Force was serving in Afghanistan, and of course they are busy arming the Ukraine. So I would say very simply that Germany is one of those countries where historical revisionism does not dominate, but it's a site of intense struggle between opposing forces. And although you haven't got time to discuss it, amongst the leading figures in the historical revisionist movement is the Green Party.
We're going to talk more about the lies people have fed about communism and indeed our history in a forthcoming podcast. Phil, historical revisionism. What's been done about the rise of this baleful excrescence? What should be done and who should be doing it?
I think it's best to talk about Britain because that's the thing we know and the thing we can influence. It's a big question because that discussion starts in every house, but goes right up to the United Nations General Assembly, which votes every year to condemn fascism, but Britain abstains. I think it starts with politics. Obviously, I see it coming from the point of view of a communist party. I would say that we need broad unity of all those who wish to retain democracy, and I mean even capitalist democracy, in the face of fascism. And that united front means that some people, even you, Stuart, are going to have to leave your water pistol in your holster and work alongside people that you might not normally work alongside. I think we have to support the teaching of history and the continuing excellent work that's often done in the classroom on these issues, and those forces in the BBC that are emerging stronger now that oppose historical revisionism. I don't know if listeners managed to catch, although it's still on iPlayer, an amazing documentary on the origins of the Holocaust, which was all about local collaboration, which of course historical revisionists don't want to talk about. I think kids are dropping history too young. I think that they think of Animal Farm and revisionism, and of course you can lie a lot easier in literature than in history. So we have to have an anti-fascism that doesn't just take on fascist history, but culture too. On the left, I don't think we even have analysed or looked historically at the role of things like the Eighth Army, the Arctic Convoy, and we don't do enough to praise the anti-fascist content and the rationale behind their actions during the war. I think we contest everywhere, in the pub, at work, online. We do it by pointing out the facts as accepted at the time and verified since. We have to imbue our democratic institutions with anti-fascist and anti-racist values and insist that unions take the lead in unifying workers, regardless of their different origins. And I think because we're communists, we obviously have an international element, and that has to extend to support those people in countries like Hungary and Romania, the Ukraine, Lithuania, and Poland who are being persecuted because of their opposition to fascism. I would say one thing, which might not be popular, but needs to be said. Just to finish, it's that in the past, people said the way to thoroughly root out fascism is to opt for socialism. But we've been down that path, and we know that doesn't root these forces out, that it doesn't just die away. So probably we need a lot more thinking about the democratic institutions of socialism and the anti-fascist culture and education of socialism in the future. But I think it's basically a united, full-on, consistent struggle of ideas, and we do it with the broadest number of people: Democrats, religious, the class conscious, and across all elements of society. But certainly we can't just go into splendid isolation and think that it's all going to go away, because it isn't.
I think you're right. I think we need to actually understand rather better than some of us do the appeal of these hideous doctrines to a large number of people. I remember my wife is still a very strong pro-European Union person, could not understand why people voted against it. I took her on a trip to Wales and we went for a walk through Merthyr Tydfil, and I said, you go around here, you see the poverty and the deprivation here. This is one of the reasons why people voted against the European Union. I'm not sure it completely changed the views, but it made her think about it anyway. But it's a major challenge. That documentary you're talking about was very, very good. I'll see if I can still get a link for that and stick it on the website. Interesting in that it spoke for about 15 minutes about what happened in Lithuania, and it spoke for about 2 minutes about what happened in Ukraine. There was a bit of historical revisionism in that program as well.
Bizarre that half the Jews that died came from that area where the Poles have been pushed in to the Western Ukraine, and that they didn't make it to the documentary. But the important thing was to show the local collaboration. And I think that rather than drop it all together, it was better to show what they did show. And I thought interestingly that a lot of the historical revisionism was being challenged from within those countries, and those were very, very brave people documenting mass graves and you know, literally going into forests looking for graves with thousands of people in them that have never been even put on the map and are denied officially by their governments. Very good documentary.
It was. There was a woman on there who wrote a book about the Lithuanian collaboration and indeed management thereof of the Holocaust. And she had to leave the country for a while. And she was asked, have you been forgiven? And she said, no, I've been forgotten, which is why I can come back. Yeah, because we need to say, by no means all Ukrainians, by no means all Polish. But there was clearly a sanitation by exclusion. A significant number of people who died in the Holocaust died in Ukraine. Okay, Dan, your closing remarks, please, mate, with a focus on action for the future.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, just as a little aside, I actually share very similar experiences with yourself when it comes to the Brexit vote. I'm very much in a minority in my own circles. It takes me back to something you said earlier about the student who equated the far left and the far right, and it does actually put me in mind of a really interesting phrase that the inimitable Michael Parenti used, which was that the centrist narrative very much reduces essence to form when it discusses the far right and the far left by essentially taking the language of the left and the right and equating the two as being, as I said before, two totalitarian evil twins. And I think that goes a great way to explaining how the centrist sort of mindset equates socialism with the far right and with fascism. So just a little interesting point on the back of what you said. Closing remarks. Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's been a real privilege to share the platform and more importantly, to listen to Phil tonight. Phil is a really tremendous authority on this issue of historical revisionism. So it has been fantastic listening to what Phil has had to say tonight. In terms of the future, I would reflect on what Phil himself said, which is we need to begin here in Britain. We are British socialists, and this is where we are based, and this is where our future action has to be focused upon. It is, of course, important to remember our internationalism, and Phil, of course, mentioned that there is an international dynamic to this as well. Our role as socialists in Britain is fundamentally to oppose our own ruling class and the oppression that they subject our own people, including ourselves too, in the form of the spiraling living costs, longer working hours, the straining and the evisceration of our public services. This necessarily must involve the opposition of our own, or the opposition to our own working class, ruling class, and its involvement in imperial aggression abroad, while supporting the people both of Ukraine and Russia, who we've spoken about tonight, in their respective fights for self-determination and against the neoliberal agenda of their own ruling classes. Socialism, to conclude, it poses a grave and existential threat and a challenge to the dominance of capital and the ruling capitalist class everywhere. And the successes of communist movements across the globe, both historically and today, show precisely where the model for future successful challenges reside. It is well worth noting that for an ostensibly dead-in-the-water dogma consigned to the dustbin of history, communism continues to haunt this dominant ruling class discourse like the ghost of the feast.
Yeah, very nicely put. We are still the spectre at the feast. Or as the original translation of the Communist Manifesto said, the hobgoblin which is haunting Europe. Thank God for the retranslation. Phil, over to you, Matt. Closing remarks, and please recommend some further reading for me and for our listeners.
I'd just like to finish by sort of echoing what Dan has said, and there's absolutely no need to repeat it. There is a job to be done, and I think that there are certain things that we need to recognise. I think that the first is that we need to think through the actual character of fascism and redefine its symbolism and its imagery, because people are looking to the wrong decades in the wrong direction. That to me is a really important thing. And the second is that we have this probably, some might think it's extraordinary, but it does seem to be that as Europe lurches to the right, that Britain, its mass organisations, its trade unionists in struggle, even to an extent its opposition to government within Labour circles, seems to be going in the other direction. And I don't think that we should worry about that. What I do think we should worry about is the power, because Britain can't exist on its own, and the power that exists across Europe that is weaponized and is imbued with ideology in a very great opposition to the kind of politics that we've got in this country, is that we get dragged. We need alliances for peace, but there's the danger that we get dragged into war. So that's what I would say. There are two books that heavily influenced me. The first is by Richard Evans, whose contribution to, there was a time when the big American publishers were involved, and everybody that was writing was involved with historical revisionism, and now it's swung the other way, and it's swung the other way because of the scholarship of people like Richard Evans. And he's written a book called Telling Lies About Hitler, and it's about fake news and all the things that people have said about Hitler, including that he was still alive. So that is a book I'd recommend to listeners. And the other one is a book that, unfortunately, I think it's quite, it's out of print, but not impossible to get because it was a Penguin, by V.G. Kiernan, called The Lords of Humankind. And what he shows is how culture is used to dehumanize people before you colonize them or destroy them. And that's a book from probably the early 60s, but a very important political history.
Yeah, I've read that one. I think it might be available on Kindle. I'll try and dig it out and stick it on there.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah, that
I'm
would be good.
Pretty sure it is, but hell, I've been wrong before. Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for all of that. A lot of good, if somewhat chilling information there. We have enjoyed talking to you two tonight. We have been CommieCast. Thank you very much indeed for listening. We are anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, and particularly anti the revisionism of what is an important history. Thank you very much indeed, and good night.
Thanks to you, Dan. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you both. Take care.
Thanks.